Here we see some of the race riots that erupted across the country. So despite the impression of the civil rights movement being all about nonviolence, there were in fact many very violent episodes. As in this one, 34 people in 1965 killed in the Watts County of Los Angeles, 1,000 or so injured, and several thousand arrested. Of course, one of the climaxes of the civil rights movement was in 1963 when Martin Luther King led 250,000 blacks and whites into Washington to demonstrate for equality. And of course, this was when King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
After the ceremonies began, Martin Luther King walked up to the podium on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and began.
I am happy to join with you.
Whoops.
Today, in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
Of course, again, you can easily find that. So some of the key things that came out of the civil rights movement was Johnson eventually being forced to sign the Civil Rights Act, which made segregation illegal. On the heels of this came the Selma March in 1965, which was really a turning point as police in Selma, small town in the United States, in southern United States, reacted very violently against nonviolent protesters. And of course, this was seen by millions of Americans on TV. And it gave Johnson really the moral courage to pass even more important rights legislation, including the Voting Rights Bill of 1965, which made it much easier for blacks to register and vote in the United States. Of course, for some blacks, the nonviolence legislation, etc., was not enough. Very famously, there was Malcolm X and the Black Muslims who advocated complete separation from whites, and you had movements like Black Power, which essentially were more or less quasi-terrorist groups arguing that blacks need their own power and they should act violently rather than relying on whites to try and befriend them and give them civil rights. Of course, part of this was all part of Johnson's scheme for what he called his Great Society, where he really wanted to sort of improve American society. He wanted once and for all for America to live up to its what's the word I'm looking for here? Its potential. And we should consider here that this had very limited success, largely because it was too ambitious, too idealistic, and the Vietnam War was so expensive that there was very little funding available for Johnson to spend on things like health care and other organizations that would help out the poor. Here we see a great political cartoon showing Johnson trying to attend to the needs of urban Americans, and behind him, of course, he's got this behemoth of a spending related to the Vietnam War. 1968, of course, a very difficult year, as we've already seen, in terms of the Tet Offensive and some of the protests linked to Vietnam. It's also sort of the climax of some of the counterculture, the hippie generation, as we've sort of come to know in popular culture today. Of course, part of the counterculture as well was the fact that baby boomers were coming of age. These were now teenagers and college students, and they trumped the causes of minorities, of gays and lesbians, and feminism, among many other causes in their demands and their protests.